Well, although only indirectly connected with projects for church union, the question of how texts circulated during the Hesychast controversy sheds an interesting light on the way theological ideas were shared and either supported or opposed during the middle decades of the 14th century. When I was translating Palamas's letter to John Zavras recently for a volume in the Liverpool University Press's translated text for Byzantine series, this one, I was struck by a passage in which it is claimed that Akynthenos kept his writings carefully under lock and key. How odd, I thought. The letter was written in the winter of 1342-43, when Akynthenos was in the ascendancy and a trusted advisor of the Patriarch John Kantakouzenos. Why should he wish to keep such a close guard over his writings? Palamas's letter recounts a visit he received in his monastic confinement near Constantinople from a supporter of Akynthenos. The unnamed visitor produced a text by Akynthenos out of a fold of his garment and proceeded to read select passages to him, which he'd marked with wax. After some discussion and an exposition by Palamas of Akynthenos' chief points, it dawned on the visitor that Palamas already had a detailed knowledge of the text. Palamas describes the moment as follows. At this point, the man who had conveyed Akynthenos' idle chatter in the first place interrupted the discourse because he saw that I had precise knowledge, not only of what he'd brought with him, but also of the other things Akynthenos had produced against the truth, and began to say in amazement, "How have you come to know this? Where, in short, did you find this?" For the wretched man thought that we had been living in ignorance of these writings and would continue to do so, since they are kept under lock and key, or rather in darkness and invisibility, so that apart from one or two of his most trusted friends, none of the others should know where on earth they might lie. Hence the statement, "I cannot understand where you found these and how they came into your hands." That's the end of the quotation. Palamas himself suggests that because Akynthenos has acquired a certain license in the present civil war and profited from the depravity of the times, he feels guilty about his writings. This, of course, is quite implausible. The text that Palamas's visitor had brought with him, as the quotations reveal, was the third treatise of Akynthenos' magnum opus, his refutations, anaskeve, of the dialogue of an Orthodox with a Baalamite. Clearly, this work had not yet been published, in inverted commas, but someone had somehow slipped Palamas a copy. To understand what's at issue here, we need to look into the notion of publication in this period. Much light has been shed on this in a contemporary Western context by Daniel Hobbins' valuable study, Authorship and Publicity Before Print. There were, of course, differences with the situation at Constantinople, chiefly because of the preeminence in the West of the University of Paris and the networks of readers of theological works provided by the religious orders, particularly in Germany. The University of Paris had what amounted to a publishing house, which turned out multiple copies of texts for the use of students. The religious orders, especially the Dominicans and the Carthusians, had well-organized distribution circles. By contrast, in Constantinople, there was no commercial book trade. The reading public was too small. The educated elite is not thought to have consisted of more than about 200 families. But in other respects, there were close similarities. The chief of these, as Hobbins has emphasized for the Western context, is that we cannot speak of a single publishing moment. Publishing was an ongoing process that began when someone, not always the author, presented or sent the work to someone else or handed an exemplar to a scribe for further copying. But the delivery of the text in this way was only a first step. The author might continue to modify and distribute his text in what we would call revised editions, long after its original delivery. Copyists might also introduce their own comments or improvements. Authors didn't own their texts as they do today. As Hobbins warns, if we look only at the printed editions, we shall fail to grasp the fact that authors before print were extremely limited in their control of a text. This helps to explain Akindinos' anxieties. Clearly, his great refutation, as Akindinos and his closest associates thought, had not yet gone beyond what Hobbins calls a reading coterie. The copy smuggled out to Palamas belongs to a second stage of publication, when it passes out of the control of the author and in hostile hands could be used to damage him. In a letter addressed a couple of years later to George Lapithis, an anti-Palamite living in Cyprus, Akindinos himself explains what it was that held him back from circulating his texts. First, in the highly charged political and ecclesiastical atmosphere of the Civil War, his friends wanted to cool the polemics. Even those who thought I was pious, he said, did not think I ought to write an answer to the newfangled talk, lest I disturb the church with my writings, as they said, and kindle the fire. The doctrinal issues of the Hesychast controversy, it was thought, were best left undisturbed. Secondly, some of Akindinos' sympathizers invoked the canonical injunction against public teaching on doctrinal matters by people who are not bishops. Akindinos thought this a bit ripe in view of the non-episcopal rank of his opponents, who seemed without any inhibition on this score. But he heeded the warning because his position as the Patriarch's chief advisor was a delicate one. After all, he'd been condemned at the Council of July 1341. Although this council was not minuted, our main source of it is Akindinos' own account of it, his censure by the bishops was held against him and prevented his being made a bishop himself, as Kalekas would have wished. Akindinos continued to try to keep control over who read his texts. In 1343, he wrote to a sympathetic scholar residing in Thessaloniki, saying that he was sending him some of his many refutations of Palamas, presumably referring to his antiretics as well as his refutations, which he had previously submitted for approval to the Patriarch John Kalekas and the Holy Synod. He wrote again in the same year, if Hero's dating is correct, to his old teacher, Thomas Magistros, or could it have been to Iakinthos, who took possession of the See of Thessaloniki in 1345, saying again that he was sending some of his writings at the behest of the Patriarch and the Holy Synod. It was through Iakinthos, in fact, a Cypriot who'd been a monk at the Hodegon Monastery in Constantinople, that he came into contact with George Lapithis, to whom he addressed the letter mentioned earlier, explaining why he was holding back his texts. In the same letter to Lapithis, he said he was sending him one of his discourses, and in another, letter 60, that he was sending him 370 of his iambics. Akindinos' opponents also witnessed to his networking. In the life of Palamas that Philotheos Kokkinos composed for the canonization of Palamas in 1368, the Patriarch recounts an episode in which a member of the entourage of a man appointed to be governor and general of the Peloponnese was a disciple of Akindinos and had been privately entrusted by his mentor with a copy of the 509 iambic verses against Gregory Palamas for discreet circulation among sympathizers in the Peloponnese. Akindinos, of course, was not the only one to use his social network to circulate his texts. Palamas did so himself on a number of occasions, not only writing mini treatises to waverers such as John Gavras, who had not yet committed themselves to one side or the other, but sending emissaries to the Latins of Galata and copies of his works to the master of the Hospitallers of Rhodes. Akindinos thinks this communication with the Latins a sign of moral depravity. But interestingly, Palamas clearly hoped to enlist Latin support for his teaching. This is not as absurd as it may sound. Palamas might possibly have had some success if the language barrier had not prevented him from discussing the issues in person and answering objections. Although we've heard from Dr. Poulis that Paul, the Latin Archbishop Paul, was not persuaded by Theophilus of Nicaea. Anyway, in any event, it was the anti-Palamites who instructed the Latins in Palamite doctrine. As Giovanni Mercati has shown, it was members of the Chrysoveries family who played a decisive role in this. Maximus Chrysoveries was a member of the circle of Dimitrios Kydonis and became a Latin Catholic and a Dominican in around 1390. His younger brothers, Theodore and Andrew, followed him into the Dominican order. Theodore made a collection of anti-Palamite writings by Maximus, Manuel Calecas, and others, and in about 1429 passed these to his other brother, Andrew, who was master of the Sacred Palace in Rome. It was thus through the anti-Palamite Greek Dominicans that Pope Eugenius IV came to be primed on the Palamite controversy. At Florence in June 1439, he tried to raise the matter with a Greek delegation that came to him in the last weeks of the council to go over outstanding theological issues, only to be told by the Greeks that they had no authorization to discuss it. Both sides at the council were aware that the teaching on essence and energies was problematic, but neither wanted at this stage to press a topic that might derail the union. To return to the earlier period, Akindinos seems to have been unusually sensitive about losing control of his texts, no doubt because of the insecurity of his position at the Patriarchate. We do not find the same anxiety in the letters, say, of Nikephoros Grigoras. Writing to the scholar Nikolaos Pepagomenos in the 1330s, well before he became involved in the Hesychast controversy, Grigoras apologizes for the delay in sending him a volume containing some of his works, but it had been asked for by someone else, and he'd only just got it back from him. Obviously, there was a waiting list of borrowers, for he asks Pepagomenos to return it to him soon. The reason why books were borrowed was generally to copy them. Scholars often exchanged their works for this purpose. In the mid-1320s, Grigoras wrote to the philosopher Joseph Rakenditis, sealing his friendship with him by sending him his works, but complaining that he'd not received his correspondent's own works. Joseph was working at the time on his great encyclopedia. Joseph, he says, must not deprive him of his learning. The books that Grigoras sends to his correspondents are mostly his scientific works on how to correct the date of Easter, on how to construct an astrolabe, and so on. He solicits works in return from scholars such as Isidore Glavas and the protonotary Lampinos. Frequently, he has to ask for the return of the books he lent them. Then, as now, getting books back was always a problem. Maintaining the integrity of his own collected works is important to Grigoras because he has an eye on posterity. He wants, he says, to keep his name alive for centuries to come. Nikephoros relied on borrowers for the multiplication of his copies, the copies of his books, because employing scribes was beyond his means. This was not a problem that affected the monk Ioasaph, the former John Kantakouzenos, Emperor of the Romans, who retained a substantial income after his tonsure. His secretary and scribe was Manuel Gicandilis, known to us through the signed colophons he appended to many of the texts he transcribed. He was the scribe employed in 1354 to help Dimitrios Kydonis produce his translation of Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles. Kantakouzenos had sponsored the translation, and subsequently Kydonis tells us how satisfied he was with the book's circulation in Constantinople. Thomas's book, Contra Gentiles, he says, is now in the hands of many, bringing much praise to the author and great profit to those who use it. Later, Gicandilis was employed by Kantakouzenos in an intensive campaign to disseminate his own works. To facilitate this effort, several scribes were sometimes subcontracted to copy sections of the work, an instance in the Byzantine context of the Petsia system that was often employed for producing multiple copies in the West. One reason for this rapid production of copies by Kantakouzenos was the situation in Cyprus. Lusignan, Cyprus, contained one of the largest Greek populations outside Byzantine control, leaving aside Asia Minor, of course. The settlement of the Hesychast controversy in favor of Palamas by the councils of 1351 and even more emphatically 1368 could not be imposed there by force. Consequently, Cyprus was a battleground for the propagandists of either side of the controversy. George Lapithis, as we have seen, had been a keen Cypriot supporter of Akindinos in the early 1340s. In 1346 or 47, a disciple of Palamas, Joseph Kalothetos, was asked by some Cypriot monks for a summary of Palamas's teaching. Later, in the 1350s, opinion may have been influenced in the island, according to Darouzé, by Ignatius of Antioch, a notorious anti-Palamite, also in favor with Hugh IV de Lusignan. Yet there seems to have been a movement in Cyprus at this time towards Palamism. Darouzé believes that the intervention and influence of the ex-emperor are not foreign to this evolution. And as Brigitte Mondrin observes, at the end of the 1360s was the richest period for books produced by Kantakouzenos. But if there was a victory, it was hard fought. In 1370-71, Kantakouzenos wrote to Bishop John of Carpathia in Cyprus, including a copy of his antiretics against Prochoros Kydonis, who'd been condemned by the Council of 1368. It seems that some of Prochoros's texts were circulating at the time in Cyprus. Kantakouzenos, thanks to his wealth and status, was able to commission luxury copies of his works. We know, for example, that he made an important donation of several liturgical and theological manuscripts to the monastery of Vatopedi. The most famous of such luxury copies is Parisina's Graecus 1242, the one with the double portrait of Kantakouzenos as emperor and monk. This was made in Constantinople between 1370 and 1375 by the monk Ioasaph of the Hodegon Monastery, whose scriptorium specialized in such sumptuous commissions. This volume contains the antiretics against Prochoros, a refutation of the anti-Palamite Isaac Argyros, and other polemical works against the Muslims and the Jews. It appears to be been made as a presentation copy. At some stage, it was deposited at the monastery of St. Anastasia in the Chalcidice, whence it was acquired in the 18th century by the king's keeper of manuscripts of the French Royal Library. Fortunately, as it happens, for the monastery was destroyed by the Turks in 1821. Given the fluidity of textual transmission, the assembly of a collected edition within the lifetime of the author was a way of establishing what the author regarded as the definitive text. Authors were constantly revising their works. Mondrin draws attention to the text of Kantakouzenos' Refutation 1 in Parisina's Graecus 1247 as a good example of a text in the course of elaboration with retouches, crossings out, and marginal additions. One of the most interesting manuscripts in this respect is Vaticanus Graecus 101, a collection of letters of Dimitrios Kydonis in his own hand with many corrections and additions. Occasionally, even whole letters are crossed out and rewritten. Was this autographed manuscript simply a collection of drafts made before the letters were actually sent? The first editor of some of the letters, Giuseppe Camelli, says that this hypothesis must be discarded. The majority of the manuscripts that have come down to us do not agree with the text established by the author in Vaticanus Graecus 101, nor are the letters in this manuscript in their chronological order, as one would expect in a volume of drafts. In Camelli's opinion, this is a collection of the letters reworked by the author as a polished literary product, perhaps towards the end of his life, which was interrupted by his death before he could complete it. Clearly, so far as the author was concerned, the original version of the letters was not especially privileged. This perhaps sheds some light on the frequent accusation of the falsification of texts that we find during the Hesychast controversy. Most famously, Athanasios of Kyzikos was reluctant to add his subscription to the synodal Tomos of 1341. An explanatory note added to the Tomos reproduced in the Ming edition mentions that one reason for the difficulty is that he had been supplied with falsified parakecharagmena copies of Palamas's texts and had therefore formed a mistaken opinion of them. It's not clear which text Athanasius has in view. Perhaps, as Meyendorff suggests, the complaint refers to an anti-Palamite anthology, citing passages out of context, such as is preserved in Barberini Graecus 291. Whatever these texts were, Athanasius was moved to write to Palamas 2 or 3 years later to ask for his comments on Akindinos' writings, presumably in this period his antiretics against Palamas, and Palamas replied at length with an exposition of the issues as he saw them. The changes introduced by an author in the redaction of his own work should not necessarily be considered sinister. When in the early 1970s, Juan Nadal Cañelas examined the writings of Akindinos preserved in a codex in Munich, Bonacensis Graecus 223, he found that Palamas's third letter to Akindinos is cited there in a different redaction from the one published earlier by Meyendorff and included in the Christou edition of Palamas's complete works. Nadal believed that the latter redaction followed the publication of the Tomos of 1341 and was occasioned by the reservations expressed by Athanasios of Kyzikos. He interpreted this as a falsification by Palamas of what he had written earlier in order to conceal his true opinions. Later scholars have not thought that either Akindinos or Palamas was guilty of falsification. I have myself suggested elsewhere that in response to Varlam's observation that if the participable light of the transfiguration is called divinity, theotis, and the divine nature beyond all cause and participation is also called divinity, there are two divinities, a higher and a lower. Palamas was originally prepared to concede that in a sense this was so, without implying ditheism, but retracted the concession after the councils of 1341 because he realized the use that could be made of it. As we've seen, the constant revision of texts by their authors was normal practice. Nevertheless, the falsification of texts was a problem about which both sides in the Hesychast controversy complained. This chiefly seems to concern the compilation of catene of passages supporting one side or the other. Passages taken out of context were thereby, according to one's opponents, falsified. Grigoras complains that whole folios and quartos were cut out of the scriptures with a sharp knife in order to change the sense, presumably intending to suggest by this that the accounts of the transfiguration in the Gospels were fraudulently interpreted by the Palamites out of context. Interestingly, Mercati has noted that a number of the patristic florilegia from this period, now in the Vatican Library, contain marginal notes explaining exactly where in Constantinople the books are located from which the passages are taken. A similar concern may be noted in the Synodal Tomos of 1351, where the sources of the patristic quotations in the Florilegium near the end are indicated with precise references. This acknowledgement during the Hesychast controversy of the importance of the context of patristic citations left its mark, as did the underlying anxiety expressed at the time about the falsification of texts. At the Council of Florence 70 years later, Mark Evgenikos argued that only the testimony of the Greek fathers should be allowed because the Greek delegation was unable to verify the citations drawn from the Latin fathers. The Greeks recognized that this was a serious weakness on their side, but the majority felt that they had to accept the Latin fathers as presented to them because they had no means of checking them. To resolve the problem, Cardinal Cesarini organized a meeting on the 26th of March, 1439, in the sacristy of the Church of San Francesco in Florence, in order to give the leading Greeks the opportunity to examine the relevant codices of both the Greek and the Latin fathers. The ensuing discussion is reported by Sylvester Siropoulos. One of the participants, Anthony of Heraclea, wanted to apply a quantitative argument. The Greek saints together outnumber the Latins, so the majority should be followed, he said. Only Mark of Ephesus raised the question of the authenticity of the texts cited by the Latins. Who knows, he said, if the books have not been falsified by them. This provoked a retort from Bessarion. If we remove all such works from the books, whole homilies and commentaries on the Gospels, complete treatises on Trinitarian theology, there'll be nothing left but blank pages. It was taken for granted, except by Evgenikos, that the Greek and Latin fathers must agree, because they were all inspired by the same Holy Spirit. In fact, Mark Evgenikos had a point. As Richard Price has shown in his important study of Latin authorities at the Council of Florence, if the Greeks had been better informed about the Latin sources, they could have put up a stronger case and not simply have capitulated to the Western line on every doctrinal issue. The Latins cited pseudepigraphical works and also authentic texts out of context, which their opponents were unable to challenge, something the disputants were not allowed to get away with during the Hesychast controversy. Price discusses the interesting example of Bessarion's response to the use of Latin patristic testimonies in the debate on purgatory, which was held early on in the council. Bessarion was able to refute Cesarini's use of Gregory the dialogist because Gregory had been translated into Greek. He could therefore contextualize Cesarini's citations and show that his conclusions from them did not follow. But this is a unique case. In conclusion, I would say that in reading accounts of the Hesychast controversy, we should always bear in mind the fluidity of the texts. It was difficult for the uncommitted to know precisely what the doctrines of either side entailed. The protagonists, as was normal practice, frequently revised their own works, while the treatises they wrote on the opinions of their opponents constantly sought to demonstrate the heretical positions to which these led, the most common rhetorical technique employed being the reductio ad absurdum. Another reason for the frequent accusations of fraud, of course. The way text circulated was usually through social networks in order to avoid such manipulation of them. The best way to ensure the stability of the text, the version the author wanted transmitted to posterity, was to produce a collected edition. But this required private financial means or institutional support. John Kantakouzenos had the means, Gregory Palamas had the institutional support, the great Lavra playing a key role in the compilation of his collected works. Lines of transmission were also important. It's a pity that Palamas did not persevere in his attempts to commend his thinking to the Latins, but the few Greek Latinists who might have facilitated this were all in the other camp. If some of his key works had found their way to Rome in the hands of sympathizers who could have explained them, rather than opponents who denigrated them, what might have been the result? Thank you very much.